How many of you could quote appropriate examples? I mean, Lewis is another one you should know, where he says, since surprised by joy, I suspect, where he finally comes to terms with the realities that he's been struggling with. And he describes his entry into the kingdom in a very Lewisian way. He said, but what he did, he said, finally, I got down on my knees and admitted that God was God, that the story was true. I was picked up and carried, kicking and struggling, into the kingdom, perhaps the most unhappy man in England that night. What an amazing conversion story. But what followed afterwards has fed particularly the evangelical world, but the whole Western Christendom that takes the supernatural seriously. Lewis, his books are in churches all over the place. It's many churches that wouldn't accept him as a member, but they love what he's written. And how many children have been given an imaginary world from the Narnia stories that does much more than entertain them? I'll never forget reading The Last Battle to my oldest daughter, who subsequently became a missionary, spent 25 years in Malawi picking up abandoned children. So I've got a lot of legal black grandchildren whose names, sadly, I do not know. But she didn't understand the story. She's an interesting woman in many ways. But I was sure that when I read the second book in the Narnia series, and you get to the stone table, that she had to recognize that was the resurrection. But she didn't, and children don't. They're too concrete. Stone table is not what happens in the Bible, so they don't have any prefiguring of it that they recognize at that point. She didn't understand that Aslan was Christ until we got to the last pages of The Last Battle. And Lewis writes, as the children are watching the dwarves quarreling in the dark in a stable about truth. And then one of them says, in our world too, the whole world was in a stable once. And that phrase, the whole world in a stable, in our world once, Aslan is Jesus. That's what. Now, how did that work in a child's brain? I don't know. She might have been 6 or 7. I don't know. I can't remember how old she was. But she knew that was the truth. Aslan was Jesus. If you're a parent or a grandparent and you've got any children around who don't know the Narnia stories, it's an incredible pleasure to read to them. And they don't get enough of that, because we're losing our way with all these screens and everything else. They don't come close to snuggling up to your mum, your dad, your grandfather, or your grandmother. Sally, in particular, had a gift for getting her grandchildren and they would listen to her read for hours, literally. And just recently we had a note from one of our grandchildren, now at the stage of looking at a permanent partner in life, and saying she looks back with fondness on those visits to the farm where Granny would read books to them, carefully chosen children's books. And they came to love literature because of it. You see, when books are read by someone you love, that adds another dimension. But the books are there as well. Now then, when you start reading them for yourself, not listening to them on iPad or whatever, but actually reading them, more is going on than we realize. One of the ways you can demonstrate that is if you picked up your Bible now, hopefully you have one, like mine. There are many tattered versions around, And I get a new one when a quarter of the page has fallen apart. Usually Ephesians is the first place to fall apart. Surprisingly, you would think it'd be Matthew 5, 6, and 7, but it isn't. But the point is that you can open your Bible and you know what you're looking for. You don't actually analyze it. Your hands flick through. You even know when you get to the right page, roughly where on the page the verse that you want is, in many cases. There are all sorts of things going on in our minds that we only vaguely understand. And what's happening in a child's mind is incredible, because I think they remember virtually everything that's said and read to them in the first 6 or 7 years. It's an incredible time for making sure no rubbish gets in and making sure all that's really good and true and beautiful does get in. Think you can do that? Now, in this same issue of First Things, someone else I like reading, and I've watched her progress over the last little while, and that's Mary Harrington, who I first came across her as a rather angry lesbian, doing all the things that lesbians do. But she's also an honest woman, and over time, she has totally changed. She's now the editor of Unheard's magazine website, and she writes very nicely and very honestly about the whole journey from living in a lesbian community to finding a husband and having a child, who, of course, has totally turned her life upside down. But she's got it organized, obviously. Husband and wife work together well, and she writes regularly. And this one is called The King and the Swarm, and it's talking about how scientific reductionism came into the world. And I think she could embroider that a little bit more. She sticks with just two aspects of reductionism. I think there are four, but in particular, she understands that meaning and purpose. The fourth of the meaning, the explanations that were required to explain something in the ancient world, disappears in a scientific world. If you can't measure it, it's not real. That's the underlying text of the university culture. So, and you can adjust the data to fit your narrative. That's what they do. Now, first of all, it's not true that science can explain everything, which it can't, because science does reduce things to less than what they are to give explanatory models that help us to understand. It is reducing things, and it's a very powerful technique. I mean, absolutely stunning. I mean, from the moment where scientific reductionism was sort of codified and given a shove in the direction of modern experimental science, when Francis Bacon said, collect facts, and he meant things you could measure. He wasn't a scientist himself. As his physician, Harvey, said, he only wrote about science, he didn't do it. But what he said changed the world. Newton was the last of the great scientists who was a medieval. He still thought that moral realities were more important than physical realities. He didn't. He said, I've just given you a model that helps to explain. I don't pretend that it's true. So goodness, beauty, and truth remain as things that science can't really deal with. That's why we can be hopeful, because you come to an end of science. It won't take you through a crisis of health, especially a crisis of health in those around you who you love. You need a bigger story than that. So what Mary Harrington is doing in this article is pointing out how our modern political world is behaving rather like a swarm of bees, and they have limited ends, and anything that gets in the way is just chewed up and thrown out. Let me close with one other little anecdote that I use every now and again, and feel free to use it, because a short personal story can be an anchor point for the way you think about things. Many years ago, when I visited St. Petersburg, I had a very moving conversation with a young woman who was moving towards Christianity and was obviously open and would get there. And what was the worst thing about growing up under the Stalin and the communist regime? And she stopped for a moment and she said, they destroyed the meaning of the word trust. And we're in a world now where the biggest problem facing all of you out there is finding a group of people with whom you can be intimate for the rest of your life and you can trust them. Many people have no one they trust. Why did they destroy it? Because they were so obsessed with control that teachers would ask small children what their parents were doing at home. So parents they couldn't be open about their faith. They had to be very careful, and they had to train their children to be very careful. In effect, they're saying you can't trust your teachers. I mean, going to school was such an innocent activity for the first few years, wasn't it? Beautiful. You can all remember the first teachers you had, what I call the Miss Minnie phenomenon from Wendell Berry's wonderful teacher, Miss Minnie. And I think the move towards home and Christian schooling is going to help in that direction, because obviously trust will not be betrayed in the same way. But we do betray trust all the while, don't we? Trust was betrayed with the management of COVID, when the three really honest experts who said you're doing it the wrong way were cancelled. Fortunately, one of them is now the head of NIH. Wonderful. Such are the ways of God. The ironies are amazing. I'd love to talk to him someday, but he's far too busy. I'd love to talk to him on this podcast. It would be great fun. Bhattacharya. I pray for him. So that's what I've got to this week. Seeing my own prejudices developed a little bit further, which is helpful to me. And I seriously suggest that you look at the August-September 2025 issue of First Things. You can do it online, firstthings.com. If you do start reading that magazine, which will change you and make you much more formidable as a defender of the faith, if you struggle with it for a year. People coming out of the science faculty, for instance, and the social science faculty couldn't read the whole journal immediately. It's going to take you a while to learn the language. They're going to increase your vocabulary and increase your way, change the ways of thinking that you have, and it will take time. So if you do read it, I got a free issue for a few years because they used a description of First Things when it first came out. Not quite true anymore. I said, it's the only journal I know that you read from the back page forwards. You can still do that, actually, although the very back page is now by Ephraim Radner, who's a great scholar, but he writes very accessibly. And this issue actually has a lovely description of his struggles. What is our real function as Christians in the world, especially in relation to the poor in every sense. It's a very beautiful article. And then the next, coming from the back forwards, the next section is while we're at it. And it's all the nonsenses that are going on in our world at the moment. They make you smile and make you cry almost as you realize just how bad the state of affairs is. Then there's an editorial that's always worth reading. There's some good book reviews. You should never read another book that's unrecommended. There are too many books out there. You need to find people you trust, and you say, oh, I really like that writer, and he's reviewing this book, and he says I should read it, I should get it. That was the way I met Alistair McIntyre. Actually, it wasn't with First Things, but it was because someone else was reading him whose mind and journey I was enjoying. And then there are long articles, short articles, and letters. Don't expect to read all of the long articles immediately, but they're about 10 or 11 pages. And one of the other things that's in Mary Harrington's article is another piece of evidence. She says North America does not read more than one book per person per year. That is terrifying. Give attention to reading, says Paul. Obviously, she's not including the Bible, I hope, anyway. So it's a recurrent theme on this podcast. What are we going to do about this? You can't just start a reading group, as I've discovered. In a church, you'd start off with quite a lot of people who think they want to read, but they haven't been trained. And so it'll drop down to half a dozen or so. And that's worth doing. But we have got to help the young in particular to find a way of really relating to literature by having it in their heads, having written it down so that they have a quotation book like this full by the time they go to university of all the great comments that great Christians have said that have been brought into their lives by grace. So, set to work. See you next week.